Hello, welcome to Remaking Medicine with me, Emily F. Peters, and today my good friend Michael, who is the CEO and founder of Pleio and is just incredible. And I worked with him for 2 years and he's just fantastic. And we're here today to talk about human emotions in medical care and healthcare, and specifically in medication, and how those human emotions really are sometimes overlooked by the healthcare system, why there's so much potential in this like sort of miracle cure of understanding human emotions. And we wanted to start today by talking about our own emotions. So welcome, Michael. How are you feeling? How are your emotions today?
Good. I'm swell. I'm curious. I'm a little unsettled. I feel like I'm walking into the doctor's office, but maybe not.
Well, I was saying I have jet lag. I'm coming straight off of a vacation and I feel very, I went from 10 days of being surrounded by people every day, kids, restaurants, everything, just people, people, people. And I feel totally alone right now for the first time in 10 days, which is such a strange feeling. And loneliness is a big part of our conversation today. So I don't know if it's quite loneliness yet, but definitely alone feeling today. And so I'm really happy to be here with you.
Great.
um, so let's talk about the loneliness and emotional component when it comes to healthcare. So tell me about your journey into Pleio right now and the lessons that you've learned from different sectors and different parts of your career into what you're doing today. And tell us more about the company, and then we'll dive in a little deeper.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. So I've had a little bit of an eclectic journey, probably not the most linear. Went from building bicycles into clinical trials. Spent some time in the fashion industry, and then found myself at Pleio. But the one thing that I've always kind of been centered on, I've always managed to converge on people and technology, and this constant dynamic tension between the two, where one creates problems, one solves problems, and they're constantly
Mhm.
that way. And yeah, personal family healthcare journey, learnings from past brought me to Pleio. Basically, leaving big company in the fashion industry to a startup, just with a gut feeling that we could do better in healthcare.
Mm-hmm. And so what is Pleio doing today? Give us the short story of how it works.
So Pleio's pretty unique in that we're strictly focused on helping people with their medication journeys, but in a very, very unique way. We focus on the emotional barriers or the psychological or behavioral barriers. The reasons that people stop taking their medication, there are probably 8 of them as defined by the AMA, 5 of which are emotional. Fear, stigma, isolation, loneliness,
Mm-hmm.
um, things like that, and they tend to be the silent ones that are often overlooked because they're not as tangible and they're a little bit more complex than some of the others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think for a long, long time in the medical industry, we talked about adherence, compliance, right? And just this idea of like, if somebody's not taking their medications because we're just not being forceful enough, like making them take it, right? Right. Or that there's some like physical barrier, either cost or something else, but it's a lot more nuanced. Do you think that that perspective is starting to change?
You know, it is changing slowly, very slowly. So, we typically we would say, patients not taking their medication, they're forgetful. Let's remind them. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
taking their medication, let's nudge them. So, very, very reactive and very, very transactional. And when we think about the patient experience and we think about like patient-centered healthcare, um, typically the focus would be on the convenience, the clinical factors, the financial factors, whereas the patient experience or the patient-centric approach is let's focus on the values and the needs of the patient and see how those influence the convenience, the clinical, the financial. So to answer your question about kind of where we see things now, we're starting to see a focus on the convenience component, but with the optic of patient centricity. How do we make it easier for patients to get medications? but that's just like really just the tip of the iceberg, like first step.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because somebody who maybe is starting, for example, like an insulin prescription for the first time, that's an emotional journey for them, right? It's not as easy as just being able to go and get the insulin and afford the insulin and have the supplies. I mean, that's like a whole moment where their whole life has changed, right?
Correct, correct. Yeah, from the point of diagnosis, in the doctor's office to the pharmacy to dispensing to the dreadful moment when you're at home with the injectable for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
How do I inject? The fear of just the click of an auto pen, for example. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
the neighbor that says, "Oh yeah, I had a horrible experience with that." Just the entire ecosystem that surrounds us at that very moment is a determinant component in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we're in this moment in 2026 of AI first, human first, right? So people might look at a problem like this and be like, fantastic, let's get some chatbots on this. What do you think about this dynamic of, when we're talking about something as sensitive as human emotion, what do you think is the right way? Or is there is it a blend? Where do we go in the technology versus human sphere?
So as I'm told by my family all the time, I do tend to oversimplify things, but I oversimplify it by thinking about it as, um, can AI replace a hug? Um,
Mhm.
when a physician sees a patient and places a hand on their shoulder, uh,
Mhm.
these haptic moments um, are a quintessential component of patient-centered healthcare. So,
Mhm.
my view is let's pick the best tool for the job. Sometimes it's a human, sometimes it's a chatbot, sometimes
Mhm.
it's text, but all of the time it's going to be a symbiosis of both of them. It's going to be both of those components. It's going to be humans and technology,
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
orchestration. But that orchestration has to be determined by the patient. And
Mhm.
what we have right now is we basically go out and say, here's something that's great for the patient. But the patient doesn't get to choose and decide enough. And
Mhm.
that I think is where AI could be particularly strong at putting choice in the patient's hands, but also empowering the patient so that they can make those choices and take those positive steps.
Mhm. Let me help you connect the right person. Tell me about the Good Starters program that you guys have and how, you're using on the human side kind of a non-traditional source of peer counselors.
Yeah. So, the bulk to support patients right now is you have healthcare professionals that work to top of license. They know the clinical components inside out, so they can handle the convenience, the clinical. You
Mhm.
have navigators that can navigate cost for the patient. But at the end of the day, let's remember the patient is a person that's just dealing with stuff.
Mhm.
Starters are regular people who are dealing with stuff too. They're not dealing with the same condition or disease state as the patient, but they're regular people from all walks of life. They're
Mhm.
through the US. They're in the same locales as the patients, and they connect with the patients just as regular people. And that's really unique because that's the essence of a human connection, right? Is being able to relate to someone and having someone be able to relate to you. So
Mhm.
this is really on these good starters, and by name I mean all that we're looking to do is really just get people off to a good start.
Mhm.
What they need, give them the momentum, and quite frankly, we start just by unoverwhelming them. So
Mhm.
the clinical world's got we have, clinical world has a lot of stuff to say for compliance reasons, has
Uh-huh.
stuff to say because therapies are complex. So we get to be that bright moment at a very unique period of time where we get the patient to take that step back.
I love unoverwhelm because it's not underwhelm. But unoverwhelm them. I feel like we could all use a little bit of that today, right? Um, And so how is technology helping with that? You kind of mentioned giving people more choice. What else are you seeing as like really big potential on the technology side to be helping with this like very human, very emotional connection side?
Yeah, so understanding human behavior is complex. It's been
Mhm.
studied, all through time.
Yeah.
Uh, Technology helps us look at human behavior from simple things like prescription records. Did the patient fill, not fill? Are they early? Are they late? Do they have gaps in therapy?
Mhm.
But behind that behavior, what's driving it from an emotional behavioral standpoint? And we get to look at the conversation. So you have simple things like tone and sentiment, uh,
Mhm.
how we change the vibe of a conversation. Does it trend more positive with certain words that we use?
Mm.
And what are those kind of triggers? More importantly, I often describe it as this giant Venn diagram that we draw. You
Mhm.
by looking at the conversations and understanding you have knowledge, skills, confidence, financial. But you look at like draw this barrier blueprint. Then you look at where you see the overlap. And the
Mm.
idea is the technology allows us at scale to look at these behaviors in a way that in the past humans could not. We just couldn't listen to a million conversations at once.
Yeah. Has any of it really surprised you? I mean, you came into this feeling like, I have a good sense of consumer marketing. I have a good sense of, you know, fashion and style and energy. Throughout this journey with Pleio, has it changed how you think about the struggles that people are having, or changed how you think about your own kind of emotional reactions to the world?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it continues to evolve, but it does come back to that concept of simplicity.
Mm.
Uh, we tend to hear if I go back to what we hear when we would listen to calls just manually, and what still comes out today is when the patients say, "This is great. I'm getting a call from outside the family, just checking,"
Mm.
and
Mm.
telling us is that it's not, they appreciate that we're not saying, "Hey, how do you feel? Did you take your med? You're late." They're basically saying, "Great, I get to take a step back. I'm not alone. It's a,
Mhm.
and there are other people like me on journeys like this."
Mm.
I think that those, getting to quantify those and see those over time validates a lot of the sort of conceptions that we had coming in.
Mhm.
Validation and a lot of evolution, but also just recognition that there's still a lot to do because we still have cost at the center of most discussions.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, we love the topic of money and medicine. I do for sure. Yeah, cost is a huge piece as well, and that's something, that's a whole other can of worms for sure. I'm curious in the design of these systems. I think one of the things that healthcare often just does so poorly is take a good intention and then execute it in a way that just completely backfires, right? And so we see, I think probably the biggest example of this is like screening forms for getting assistance, right? And you're like, this is great. I'm going to offer everybody in my community free access to healthy food. Love that. That's an incredible, good intention for your community. And then saying, well, we're going to have them fill out like a 20-question survey first that asks them like incredibly personal questions, with like zero nuance on like 1 to 10 scale questions. Are you feeling like that's a big part of the design side of this that just does not work for so many people in healthcare?
Exactly, and it comes back to the unoverwhelming, right? I think just in our everyday lives, when we have someone that comes to us and says, "How can I help?"
Yeah.
and then you get your other friend that comes over with, a pick and a shovel, and they're helping you dig your garden. The "How can I help?" there's a barrier there
Yeah.
because it means you have to think about how could this person help me? Could I really ask them to help me? Whereas the other person's pitching in and they're getting
Mm. Mhm.
down to the way I see it, removing the friction.
Mm.
A
Mhm.
lot of friction in these processes, and it's mind-boggling to me that the whole the whole industry around cost navigation is so complex and overshadows the basic principles of patient-centered care, which is
Mm-hmm.
isn't their needs. We get
Mm-hmm.
needs is financial, but their needs, and there are other needs that actually facilitate progression through financial concerns.
Like what?
So knowledge, confidence, and skills.
Mm.
Each of those interplays with the financial component. To your point, filling out the forms.
Mm-hmm.
If the person does not have the confidence to fill in those forms,
Yeah.
they can't even get to the skill, right, of filling in the forms.
Yeah.
They don't have the knowledge of, health literacy, for example,
Yeah.
is a huge one across the board, which is something that we tackle with the way we speak to patients.
Mm. Yeah, I have been shocked over and over again as a person who's working on the side of trying to get patients to do things and doing engagement and community engagement and outreach, just how bad it feels as a patient to fill out some of these forms or to answer some of these questions or to get these calls from people who are supposed to be here to help you. And it's just, I think there's something about big system design, right? When we're trying to help something like millions of people, we tend to lose sight very quickly of like what that experience is actually going to feel like as a patient, right?
I think that's definitely a place where AI can help, because we do take this boil, the ocean approach, where we call a patient, we got to get, through a script, we got to communicate everything, but that everything is different for patients. So truly personalized communications to get through to truly personalized resources. So socioeconomic, if it's therapy related, condition related, is it health system related? There are all these different variables at play, but we don't need to address every one of them every time. The patient is best served by having everything be digestible. It's all habits, right? Getting the patient to do one simple thing, and then they'll do another simple thing and another simple thing. Saw this era where as an industry we were throwing apps at patients, like down the app, log your pills, scan this, do that, and I say it all the time. We actually chose to replace the medication adherence problem with an app adherence problem. So we were solving the problem and sort of compounding the disillusionment for the patient.
Yeah. When the patient's there and they're like, you're trying to throw all this stuff at me, and what I really need is a different kind of way to open the bottle. Right? Like, you're not listening to what I really need here in this situation.
Yep, that's exactly it. And a lot of it is driven sort of by the metrics by which a lot of patient support programs are measured. And they're very simply by the concept of, they have been very simply managed by the concept of more.
More.
Times did you touch my patient? How long have you spoken to them? And things like that. Whereas behaviorally, it takes a little bit of time, but you need to look at refill behaviors, persistency curves. But it often takes a little bit of time to get to those, and this is made based on the more. But it's more in terms of, are you throwing more stimulus at the patient, as opposed to, are you getting them to refill sooner? Are you getting them to refill more? Are you addressing those gaps in therapy? And historically, a lot has been driven also by first fill behavior. Let's just get the patient to first fill, and adherence. Adherence would tend to be secondary.
I think, coming up in Silicon Valley, and also from you in the, the tech and the consumer goods industry, you can't manage what you can't measure is such gospel, right? And everything in Silicon Valley is, what's your KPI on this, and how are you going to measure this and this? And I just, yeah, increasingly have become sort of self-radicalized that it doesn't always work in healthcare, right? I don't know that we have been good at measuring, what really matters and what really, patients care about and what makes for a healthy and fulfilling life, right? Are there indications you think that we should be measuring for in different ways or that we should quit measuring?
I think if you look at stuff like a net promoter score, and if you were to bring something like that into the equivalent into a patient journey,
Mm,
get the patient feedback as to how they feel about their,
mm,
and then build from there. We definitely have the metrics like refill rate. We have gaps in therapy. The work we
mhm.
do, the ones we're seeing great results in getting patients to titrate up. Very unique space right now, because every titration is essentially like a new start with an increased level of kind of side effects and concerns.
Mhm.
But I think that yeah, we have to get to those longer term behavior
Mm,
metrics. So it's not the metric that gets measured within a year that's tied to a strategic imperative, but the concept of a long-term relationship with the patient, because we're talking about patients that, for the bulk of what we do, we're not talking about, acute meds. We're talking about chronic disease states where
mhm,
patient, for better or for worse, must develop a relationship with their medication and must
mm,
have a relationship with their medication journey. And that's not a one and done, right?
mm,
That's a question of building positive behaviors over time. So they can't be measured,
mm.
in 3 months. It takes time.
I love that. I love that idea of developing a relationship with the medication. That's such an incredible way to think about compliance, right? That is really so much more grounded. And I think those of us who have um, either had a long-term prescription or are supporting family members with long-term prescriptions, you do become very like emotionally attached to these pills, right? Like, they
Yeah,
become part of your life.
yeah, and it's that positive relationship. The
Mm.
journey can't be perceived as it can't be perceived as it's tax season. I need to do my taxes. It needs to be as it's a refund check coming from my taxes. It's just
Yeah.
it's a different optic. And it comes with acceptance, right? There's definitely
Yeah.
accepting the condition, but then recognizing that the emotions are going to change over time, and the
Right.
relationship with the medication will change over time. So, yes, you form a habit over 21 days, but things change. Diseases
Yeah.
may progress.
Yeah.
You may have polypharmacy, you may have comorbidities. It is complicated. So,
I think there's a sense in healthcare as well that net promoter score, which I think is an incredible metric to look at, but that it's oversimplified, right? And that, you can't ask somebody about net promoter because all they care about is did they get, if they came in seeking pills, they got the pills that they wanted. And there's sort of like a dismissal, I think, of the patient perspective. Let's talk more about net promoter score. And do you hear that same kind of pushback of like, well, that's not the right way to talk about what a patient
yeah,
cares
so
about? Yeah.
I'm probably the best NPS detractor. But I was, we used it when I was in fashion,
Uh-huh.
and we had great net promoter scores. And then I was looking at the ability for net promoter to predict renewal, so on and so forth, and actually true satisfaction. And yes, I mean, simpler is better, in my experience. And it might be a hybrid, given the complexity, and it might be an NPS type metric that's used over time.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that I think there's my call to the industry is simplification, right?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
talk about drug pricing all the time, and it's not complicated. There's an industry that thrives on that complexity, which we
Yeah.
said we're going to talk about, so we won't. But
We can talk about it. We have some time. We can
but
talk about it. Yeah.
but simplifying the patient journey.
Yeah.
For us, again, it's about removing the barriers to non-adherence. We focus on the emotional barriers.
Yeah.
Uh, so, getting metrics in terms of, patient satisfaction relative to their relationship with that medication.
Mm,
Uh, it's complicated. It'll take some work,
mm.
but I do think it's the right direction.
I think there's a question. I saw it for many, many years with health technologies, but just I don't think we ask ourselves the question often enough in the healthcare sector of like, what if the patient is right with this concern? Right. And same thing, like, what if the physician is right with this concern? What if they're not being non-compliant because they're just non-compliant? Like, what if they're actually right?
Yeah, I mean, and that by the day becomes increasingly more complicated
Mm,
because the patients have been able for quite some time now to be able to rely on Dr. Google.
mm,
Now they have Dr. Claude.
mm.
Sorry, Claude. They can folks are uploading results, and
Mm,
the patients are in many cases too right. And if you think
mm,
about it, that you have a series of patients that in isolation are making clinical decisions on their own,
mm,
with a tremendous trust in AI. So historically, we would focus on developing conversation starters for patients. We want patients to go back to their pharmacist, trusted physician, to have a productive discussion. And
mm.
not, you had this concept. You had a little bit of the white coat syndrome where I'm just a regular person. I can't ask that question of my healthcare professional. Now, probably one of the concerns is that the reverse is happening, where they're not going to go in because they feel the questions are answered and they don't have to deal with the stigma of asking their healthcare professional. So having folks make these decisions in isolation
Yeah.
without being able to impact them is probably a greater concern.
Yeah. A new point of detachment from the healthcare sector. And I think that, we can also look at patients being right in terms of the financial side, right? People in the sector might say, yeah, but there's these coupons and there's this and there's that. Like, how are you actually navigating through this incredibly complex system to get those benefits? Which benefits are available through your insurance or not, only if you're cash pay and this and that. Like, maybe they're right that like the way that we're trying to price this is too complicated.
Yeah, and I mean that's where we're focusing on partnerships in that space, right? Because
Mm,
we've got the emotional piece, and we're constantly working with different partners that have tackled that transactional piece.
mm,
Those that can solve for it, because it is a great place for AI, to do like prior authorization or benefits verification through an automated call that goes to
mhm.
the call center. Perfect use, perfect use. And it seems to me that that problem should not, that problem should solve itself in theory pretty quickly given technology and the ability to navigate vast amounts of information and
Right.
basically say, Emily, this is the right price for you. It's done. Check.
Should be easy. Should
Everything's
be
filled
easy.
out. All the
Yeah.
discussions we had. Here's your confirmation. You're good.
Yeah,
And
and just I do think it's a very interesting moment with AI potentially allowing us to not have to fix some of these really overly complicated systems that we've created in the last couple of decades in healthcare, right? Where, from the EHR and healthcare technology side, often we're looking at the EHRs are so broken, they're so complicated, the way that we're trying to navigate this. And now, AI has sort of given us a chance to say, well, maybe we don't have to fix it in the way that we thought we'd have to fix it, right? Maybe that complexity can continue to exist. And same thing in, medication pricing. Maybe we don't have to necessarily fix this like just bonkers system that has 17 different prices for different places that you get the medication. Maybe that's okay, but AI will allow us to kind of simplify that experience.
yeah, I do think that one of the greatest gifts of AI is basically, again, being able to take all these disparate systems.
Mm.
We would have to look at, database schemas and try to link them, and we'd use, APIs and different integrations where, that almost happens instantaneously,
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful that that part gets solved.
Right. Right. That's the optimist view. I guess the pessimist view would be like, great, AI will come up with like now we had 17 different payment options before. Now we're going to have 17,000 different payment options. It could go the other direction, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So it comes down to, the biggest challenge with AI in healthcare is really the compliance piece. So
Mm.
there are elements of what we do that we can hand off to AI.
Hmm.
But generally speaking, um, firm is not completely ready for it from a compliance standpoint. We have a chief medical officer, we have medical writers, very, very strict compliance, independent QA. Um, Very few, if any, are ready to hand that all off to
Hmm.
AI at this point.
Hmm.
When it comes to these, critical patient conversations.
Hmm. Hmm. Let's talk about GLP-1s, right? And how, I mean, what a fascinating moment to have both these AI trends coming in, like we talked about, and also a whole massive new category of prescription that's very compliance intensive, right? That has a lot of drop off, a lot of non adherence. You know, if you think back to maybe 4 years ago, it seems like everything was very different, right?
Absolutely, becoming increasingly accessible in terms
Mm.
of cost, in terms of access, just being able to actually get the medication in hand. There were shortages, or a bunch of different.
Mhm.
So you have the whole direct to patient era now that's forming, and we've seen different. We've seen it in different forms over time. This one feels serious, right? Because it's happening at high volume.
Yeah.
In a space that people are excited about, because theoretically in a GLP-1 you have a drug that does all the heavy lifting, and is an elixir for many of the chronic diseases that out there, and there are new indications being added continuously. So back to that, the concept of patient-centered care. Uh, Great, the convenience piece. Great, we're focused on that. We're getting it as close to the patient as possible. But the biggest gap is still there. Are we addressing the values and the needs, the value system and the needs of the patients that are
Mhm.
core to their decision making? There's such a big rush to say, okay, great, we're going to get volumes of drugs to volumes of patients, but those patients are still stuck in the same way. They have a
Mm.
starting dose. They feel, might feel a little ill, might have some side effects. Then they get to a therapeutic dose and they need to start all over again. And managing that journey goes well beyond just getting the medication shipped to that patient. When I was at the health conference, there's a leading obesity doctor, Spencer Nadolsky, influencer, posts all the time, and I liked what he said. He said, the view of direct to patient programs is pill mill plus app. In other words, get the volume out there. I mean, it's a little bit of a pessimistic view. It's not bad, but directionally, they're actually pretty accurate. The belief is, give the patient a digital tool, give them the medication, and they're going to figure it out because it's the best app, it's the best platform ever built, and the medication does all the heavy lifting.
Mhm.
And we all know that, of course, it's a little more complicated than that.
I mean, especially with GLP-1s, which are, injectable, so that's very intense. You're taking it every month forever. Like that's a very intense patient journey that we're trying to put these people on.
Absolutely, absolutely, and look, the oral versions are coming out.
Mhm.
That'll absolutely help. But you still have side effect profiles, still have gaps in therapy, and you also still have, if we're talking about use for weight loss, you still have the concepts of diet and exercise that are still part of that treatment plan. So again, it's not just about giving them the digital platform and, giving them,
Hmm.
getting them the pill. So
Hmm.
I've often kind of equated it to sort of like having Peloton without an internet connection.
Mm,
Uh,
yeah.
so
Yeah, Peloton's such a great example because people do also have, you talked about that emotional relationship with the medication. People have very strong emotional connections to the Peloton instructors, right?
it,
And to the Peloton
it
experience.
goes well
Yeah.
beyond just having someone, kind of shouting at you and, telling it is that human connection with, with your trainer who you vibe with essentially.
Yeah, the vibes are the miracle drug is the vibe.
Yep.
Oh, well, let's start to, we only have a few more minutes here. Let's talk about, what are some positive changes that are giving you, are you feeling generally like optimistic about how healthcare is shifting right now? Are you optimist, negative, pessimist? Like, where are you thinking?
Yeah.
Do you ping
So
pong back and forth daily?
yeah, I'm forever optimistic, but a decade in the fashion industry where I worked in, unfortunately or fortunately, fast fashion enablement,
Mm.
where inventories would turn on 4 to 6 week cycles. Fashion adopted technology and did things really, really quickly, and it was very emotionally charged. I can
Mm.
folks that design and develop clothing um, are tightly wound emotionally, and stuff gets done. Healthcare moves slow.
Mm.
Healthcare adopts technology really, really slowly. So my ray of light is with the direct to patient programs is a recognition that we need to move the medications closer to the patient, which
Mm.
implies better accessibility, and it implies decomplexification. I need to make up another word.
Under overwhelming and
Yeah,
decomplexification are two. Yeah, we need simpler
so
words for these
yeah,
concepts.
simplification. Simplification would be too simple.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that trend. Uh, if you think about the compliance barriers to get direct to patient running, and the fact that these programs are in place right now, I think that that's the guiding light.
Mm.
I do think that there's going to be we tend to take a step back, take a step back to take two forward, and I think
Mm.
that's kind of where it's going to go. But I do think the direct to patient space is absolutely a positive light,
Mm.
positive directionally. And I do think the other space that I'm really curious about and interested to see sort of is the simplification of specialty pharmacy. Uh,
Mm.
you have specialty pharmacies, you have hubs, you have patients, you have pharmaceutical companies, and no one is happy in that mix. So I do think that that's the other one.
Yeah.
And I can say just heading into Assembia here in a couple of weeks, a lot of great conversations going to be had there, and it's nice to see how that's moving directionally. Um,
Hmm. The
would like,
resurgence of the specialty pharmacy.
yeah, would love to see the resurgence of the specialty pharmacy, and I'm just looking to see disruption of what a hub really is.
Yeah, I'm very interested to see what happens in the pharmacy space to move away from these massive retail footprints. The world that we lived in 10 years ago of having, four Walgreens on a corner, four intersections, towards something that, what does that future look like? Could we have smaller, cooler stores? Could we have, I don't think we've gotten yet, we're still in the sort of burning down phase and not necessarily yet the like phoenix from the ashes phase. It could be very cool.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, absolutely, and looking forward to it. I mean, look, it's great for us because we're on again on the corner of human and technology, and patient medications and their emotions,
Mm.
and that's not going to go away. And
Mhm.
for us, what's most rewarding is just seeing the results every day, and honestly, just now being able to listen to patients at scale,
Mm.
kind of validation for what we do.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Well, tell us about what are you reading or listening to, or where do you get inspiration when you're thinking about human-centered care? Like, what information are you taking in that's really valuable for you?
Yeah, so so you get a lot of obviously a lot of inspiration coming from patients, for sure. Being able to triangulate a lot of different data points, using AI is fascinating. Opens up horizons. If I look at how I could relate Hannah Arendt to loneliness to patient journeys, fascinating, right? But
Mm.
we did some work, on looking at loneliness, and probably one of the most fascinating journeys that I've taken in this space.
Mm.
So Jeremy Noble's book, Project Unlonely, where it's all about human connection and the need for patients to build a relationship with their therapy and not just focus on the protocol.
Mm.
I would say that that's probably one of the guiding lights. And the second that I anchor on all the time, World Health Organization developed a platform which is essentially the 5 dimensions of adherence.
Mm.
Patients, the socio economic views, their health system, their therapy, and their condition, and kind of how all those need to stay in balance.
Mhm.
That's what's on my whiteboard. That's what keeps me anchored, because that's what reminds me there's no silver bullet. Uh,
Mm.
However, there are these enablers, these catalysts, these force multipliers, and that's where Nobel's book, opened my eyes to say, well, wait a minute, loneliness and connection is dramatically impactful,
Mm.
in terms of being patient journeys across all of those dimensions. So ongoing work, but I kind of
Yeah.
set, and then kind of look to prove or disprove theories along the way.
Oh, I love, yeah, I will double your shout out for the book Project Unlonely, and for the whole project that they're running, talking about the different facets of loneliness. That book really changed how I thought about loneliness as well. The idea that you can feel lonely even if you're surrounded by tons and tons of people, just because you might feel different from the people around you, that there's these different dimensions to loneliness, and they're really thinking about it from the perspective of a physician, as a big piece of our healthcare landscape. There's a lot of talk about how, for a long time, kind of fitness wasn't necessarily considered part of healthcare, right? It was sort of like,
Right.
it was obviously there was a relationship, but it was like off to the side. And, now that has come kind of more back into the fold. Mental health, behavioral health has come back into the fold. And I think this idea of emotional health, and the emotional dimension, I see that coming back in the folds in healthcare. And that's such a powerful dimension. I'm really glad that we get to work with him. He's so great.
Yeah, it is just awesome. And, I could say in the time that we've been kind of working on GLP-1s, at first, the obesity indication, it was discussed as it's going to be a vanity drug. It's a vanity.
Mm.
Just not long ago, there was not recognition that obesity is a medical condition. It's,
Mm-hmm.
and that, that ties a lot, to how people, will become disconnected and feel lonely through stigma. And
Mm-hmm.
I would say definitely one of the most fascinating aspects of the book is basically how loneliness impacts negative health behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Well, on health,
Mm-hmm.
but just how people struggle because they're lonely and how they don't do certain things.
Mm. We have a lot of work to do. Well, where can people find you and learn more about Pleio and learn more about you and your perspectives? Where should we go?
So LinkedIn, my LinkedIn is always great. My name right here. Always looking for outreach. Love having these discussions. Pleio.com is another great place. Uh,
Yeah. And we'll see
and
you at
yeah, just
Assembia for people who are in that
yes,
world.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, definitely. And I'm going to get that post out today.
We're all running a little bit behind. Well, I really am just so grateful for the work that we get to do together. I think this idea, this emotional component, this very human component, it's just so ripe. I think there's so much that we tend to take for granted when it comes to how, just very natural, very human existence factors into our overall healthcare landscape. And so I'm just very grateful that we get to work together.
Yeah, thank you so much. And my favorite part about all this is it feels good, and it's
Yeah.
always nice to work in a feel good space
Yeah.
with good people, great people. So
Yeah. I
definitely
love that.
definitely
Well, thank you so much, Michael. I'm really glad we got to talk today. And I hope, we've sparked something in many people to think about the emotional side, the human side of how we design for a better healthcare system.
great. Thanks.